The most dangerous person in any room isn't the narcissist. It isn't the manipulator, the sociopath, or the person with the loudest voice and the sharpest tongue. Carl Jung spent decades mapping the architecture of the human psyche, and what he found turned conventional wisdom completely inside out. The most dangerous person in any room is the empath who has stopped being nice. Not the wounded empath still bleeding for everyone. Not the codependent empath performing kindness to earn love. The one who went through the fire of their own shadow, integrated every rejected piece of themselves, and came out the other side with their perception fully intact and their need for approval completely dead. Jung called these individuals individuated empaths, but what he described was something the people around them experienced as genuinely dangerous. Not dangerous like a threat. Dangerous like a force that could not be manipulated, could not be guilt-tripped, could not be controlled through any of the emotional mechanisms that work on almost everyone else. And that kind of psychological immunity terrifies people who depend on those mechanisms to get what they want. Today I'm going to show you the 9 specific reasons Jung identified that make a fully awakened super empath one of the most psychologically dangerous people alive. Why each of these qualities threatens the structures most people depend on, and why, if you recognize yourself in what I'm about to describe, you've become something far more powerful than you realize. The first reason a true super empath is dangerous is that they see your entire psychological structure within minutes of meeting you. Jung documented that empaths who had done deep shadow work developed what he called total field perception. They didn't just pick up on emotions or energy. They perceived the entire architecture of someone's psyche almost instantly. The defenses, the wounds driving those defenses, the mask being worn, what the mask was protecting, and the unconscious strategy the person was running to get their needs met without having to be vulnerable. This isn't intuition in the vague sense most people mean. This is precision reading. The super empath sits across from you at dinner, and within minutes they know you're performing confidence to mask a terror of being seen as weak. They know your humor is a deflection mechanism. They know your generosity has conditions attached even though you'd never admit it. They perceive the gap between who you're presenting and who you actually are. And they see it with a clarity that would be disturbing if you knew what was happening behind their calm expression. What makes this dangerous is that most social interaction depends on people not seeing each other clearly. Relationships, business dealings, family dynamics, friendships, all of these function because people accept performances at face value. The super empath doesn't. They can't. Their nervous system processes information at a depth that bypasses social agreements to pretend. And someone who sees you completely without needing you to confess or explain holds a kind of power that can't be defended against because you don't even know they have it. The second reason is that they cannot be emotionally manipulated. This is the quality that makes super empaths most threatening to people who rely on emotional control. Jung found that once an empath had fully integrated their shadow and done the brutal work of confronting their own patterns of people-pleasing, guilt absorption, and compulsive caretaking, they developed what he described as emotional sovereignty. Their emotional state became self-generated rather than other-dependent. They still felt deeply. They still perceived everything around them. But their internal world was no longer hostage to external pressure. Guilt trips don't work on them because they've already faced every guilt their shadow could generate. Silent treatment doesn't work because they've learned to be profoundly comfortable in silence and solitude. Rage doesn't intimidate them because they've confronted their own capacity for rage and integrated it. Love bombing doesn't hook them because they've learned to source their own validation internally. Every manipulation tactic depends on the target having an unmet need that the manipulator can exploit. The super empath has done the work of meeting their own needs. There's nothing left to exploit. Jung observed that manipulative personalities became visibly destabilized around individuated empaths. Their entire toolkit was suddenly useless. The charm that worked on everyone else produced only a calm, seeing gaze from the super empath. The threats that controlled other relationships met a person who was genuinely willing to lose the connection rather than betray themselves. This created a dynamic where the manipulator felt powerless for possibly the first time, and powerlessness in someone accustomed to control produces either genuine transformation or escalating hostility. The third reason is that their silence communicates more than most people's words. A super empath who has stopped explaining, defending, and over-communicating becomes extraordinarily unsettling to be around. Jung noted that individuated empaths developed what he called sovereign silence. They stopped filling conversational space with justifications. They stopped explaining their boundaries. They stopped trying to make others comfortable with their choices. They simply existed in their truth without narrating it. This silence is dangerous because it removes the handles that people use to engage in conflict. You can argue with someone's words. You can pick apart their reasoning. You can find logical holes in their explanations. But you cannot argue with someone who looks at you calmly, says nothing, and simply doesn't engage. The silence forces the other person to sit with their own behavior without the distraction of a debate to hide in. And for many people, being left alone with the reality of their own actions is the most uncomfortable experience imaginable. The super empath silence becomes a mirror. Not one they hold up deliberately, but one that exists simply because the empath has stopped performing the social rituals that normally prevent people from seeing themselves clearly. The fourth reason a true super empath is dangerous is that they will walk away from anything. Jung found this was perhaps the most destabilizing quality an individuated empath possessed. They had developed genuine non-attachment, not the spiritual performance of non-attachment where someone pretends they don't care. Actual, tested, proven willingness to lose any relationship, any situation, any connection that required them to abandon themselves. They had already survived the thing most people spend their lives avoiding. They had already lost everything that mattered and rebuilt from the ground up. So, the threat of loss, which controls almost every human being on the planet, had no power over them. This willingness to walk away isn't cold or callous. It emerges from having been through enough pain that the super empath knows with absolute certainty what they can survive. They've already lost relationships they thought would kill them. They've already endured the silence of empty rooms after cutting off people they loved. They've already grieved the fantasy of who someone could have been. And they're still here, still whole, still sovereign. So when someone tries to control them with the implicit threat of, if you don't comply, I'll leave, the super empath's honest internal response is something like, that would hurt, but I'll be okay. And there's nothing more dangerous to a controlling dynamic than a person who genuinely means that. Before we continue, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get true self-discovery. The fifth reason is that they expose dysfunction simply by being present. The super empath doesn't have to say a word about what's wrong with a system, a family, or a relationship. Their very presence, their refusal to participate in dysfunctional patterns, reveals those patterns to everyone involved. Jung called this the mirror effect of the individuated personality. When one person in a system stops playing their assigned role, the entire system becomes visible. Think about what happens in a family where everyone maintains an unspoken agreement to never discuss the obvious dysfunction. Everyone performs their role. The enabler enables. The scapegoat absorbs blame. The golden child performs achievement. The system works because everyone participates. But the moment the empath stops playing their role, stops absorbing, stops enabling, stops performing, the entire machinery becomes visible to anyone paying attention. The dysfunction that was hidden by everyone's participation is suddenly exposed by one person's refusal to participate. This makes the super empath dangerous, not because they're doing anything aggressive. They're dangerous because functional authenticity in a dysfunctional system is inherently destabilizing. They don't need to point out the problem. They become the evidence that a problem exists, and the system will often attack them for this, labeling them as the problem, the difficult one, the one who changed and ruined everything. But Jung understood that the person being attacked for disrupting dysfunction is usually the healthiest person in the room. The sixth reason is that they understand darkness without being consumed by it. This is the quality that separates a true super empath from someone who is merely sensitive. Jung was adamant that genuine psychological power required shadow integration, which meant the empath had to confront and claim every dark capacity within themselves. Their potential for cruelty, selfishness, manipulation, rage, and destruction. Not to act on these things, but to acknowledge their existence honestly. An empath who has integrated their shadow understands the full spectrum of human behavior from the inside. They know what drives cruelty because they've felt the impulse in themselves. They understand manipulation because they've recognized their own manipulative tendencies. They comprehend narcissistic defense because they've faced their own ego inflation. This understanding makes them dangerous because they cannot be fooled by darkness wearing a disguise. They recognize it instantly because they've met it in their own mirror. Most people are vulnerable to manipulation because they can't conceive that someone would operate from such darkness. The super empath has no such blind spot. They've walked through their own darkness and mapped it thoroughly. So, when they encounter it in someone else, they don't freeze in disbelief or make excuses. They recognize it with the calm familiarity of someone identifying a landscape they've already traveled. And this recognition gives them the ability to respond strategically rather than reactively, which puts them several psychological moves ahead of anyone trying to manipulate them. The seventh reason a true super empath is dangerous is that they have mastered the art of selective vulnerability. Jung observed something counterintuitive about individuated empaths. They weren't walled off or emotionally unavailable. They were actually capable of deeper intimacy than most people could handle. But they chose with extraordinary precision who received access to that depth. Their vulnerability was no longer compulsive or indiscriminate. It was strategic, conscious, and earned. This selective vulnerability is dangerous because it means the super empath can move through the world, appearing open and warm without actually being accessible to anyone who hasn't proven trustworthy. Surface interactions feel pleasant and even connected, but the person on the other side has no idea that they're interacting with only one layer of the empath's actual depth. The super empath controls how much of themselves is visible, not through deception, but through wisdom about what different relationships can actually hold. Jung described this as the difference between walls and membranes. Walls block everything. Membranes allow selective passage. The super empath replaced their walls with membranes that permitted genuine connection with safe people while remaining impermeable to those who would exploit their openness. This means they can sit in a room full of people, appear completely engaged and present, while maintaining absolute sovereignty over their inner world. They give nothing away that they haven't chosen to give, and they do it so naturally that most people never sense the membrane between them. The eighth reason is that their empathy has become a weapon of precision rather than a wound of absorption. The unhealed empath feels everything and is overwhelmed by it. The super empath feels everything and uses the information strategically. Jung found that once empaths stopped absorbing emotions and started simply perceiving them, their empathic ability transformed from liability into extraordinary advantage. In conflict, the super empath perceives exactly what the other person is feeling, what wound is driving their behavior, and what they're most afraid of. They don't use this information to attack, but they use it to remain completely unmanipulated and to respond with surgical precision rather than emotional reactivity. While the other person is flooded with emotion and acting from unconscious patterns, the super empath is reading the entire dynamic with a calm clarity that allows them to choose the most effective response rather than the most reactive one. This transformed empathy also makes the super empath dangerous in positive contexts. In healing relationships, they perceive exactly what someone needs to hear. In leadership, they sense the unspoken dynamics that are sabotaging a team. In creative work, they channel emotional depth that resonates at levels most creators can't access. The same ability that once made them a doormat now makes them one of the most perceptive and effective people in any context they choose to engage with. The ability didn't change. How they use it did. The ninth reason a true super empath is dangerous is that they have stopped needing to be understood. This final quality might be the most powerful and the most unsettling of all. Jung observed that the final stage of empathic individuation involved releasing the need for external validation of one's perception, experience, or identity. The super empath no longer requires anyone else to understand them, agree with them, or acknowledge their reality. They know what they perceive, they trust their own consciousness, and they've stopped performing clarity for an audience that can't receive it. This is dangerous because needing to be understood is one of the primary hooks that keeps people engaged in draining dynamics. You stay in arguments because you need the other person to see your perspective. You over-explain because you need validation that your feelings make sense. You return to relationships because you need the other person to acknowledge the harm they caused. The super empath has released all of these hooks. They don't need you to understand. They don't need you to agree. They don't need you to validate what they already know is true. Jung recognized that a person who doesn't need to be understood becomes psychologically untouchable. You can't bait them into arguments because they have nothing to prove. You can't gaslight them because they trust their perception more than your version of events. You can't guilt them into returning because they've accepted the cost of their sovereignty. They've become a closed circuit of self-validation, not because they're arrogant or isolated, but because they've learned that outsourcing their sense of reality to others was the mechanism that kept them trapped in the first place. What makes all 9 of these qualities collectively dangerous is that they exist in someone who still feels everything. The super empath isn't a sociopath. They haven't shut down their sensitivity. They haven't become cold or detached. They've become something far more formidable. A person who perceives the full depth of human emotion and psychology while maintaining complete sovereignty over their own internal state. They feel your pain without drowning in it. They see your shadow without fearing it. They understand your manipulation without falling for it. And they love from a place of wholeness rather than need, which means their love is real but can never be weaponized against them. Jung spent his career studying the process by which wounded individuals became whole. He called it individuation, and he believed it was the most important work a human being could undertake. For empaths, individuation doesn't diminish their sensitivity. It weaponizes it. Not weaponizes in the aggressive sense, but in the sense that their perception becomes a precision instrument rather than an open wound. Every quality that once made them vulnerable becomes a source of genuine power when properly integrated. If you recognize yourself in these 9 qualities, understand what you've become. You're not the bleeding empath the world wants you to be. The one who absorbs everyone's pain and calls it purpose. The one who forgives endlessly and calls it spiritual maturity. The one who stays in situations that destroy them and calls it love. You've evolved past that. You've done the shadow work. You've confronted your own darkness. You've released the need for approval, validation, and understanding from people who couldn't give it even if they wanted to. And the result is that you've become genuinely dangerous to every system, relationship, and dynamic that depends on your compliance, your guilt, your fear of abandonment, or your compulsive need to heal everyone around you. You've become someone who can see clearly, feel deeply, and act wisely, all at the same time. That combination is rare. Jung knew it was rare, and he knew that the people who achieved it would never again fit comfortably into the unconscious structures that most people call normal life. That's not a loss. That's the price of becoming real, and it's worth every relationship that couldn't survive your transformation. Every system that expelled you for refusing to play your role. Every person who called you dangerous because they could no longer control you. You're not dangerous because you want to harm anyone. You're dangerous because you can no longer be harmed by the mechanisms that keep everyone else asleep. And in a world that runs on emotional manipulation, guilt, and unconscious compliance, a person who is immune to all 3 is the most dangerous thing there is. If you haven't yet, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.